Good evening. My research project is on the effects of elapsed times between stretching and running on speed performance. Before I begin, let me tell you about myself. My name is Goins, I attend Chatham High School, and in the fall I'll be attending Virginia Tech, majoring in accounting. I chose this topic because as someone who has played soccer for 15 years and have been physically active for most of my life, I've dealt with a lot of injuries. The biggest issue that I faced has been muscle tightness. Because of this issue, I want to further my knowledge in stretching techniques to understand how I can minimize my muscle tightness and improve my athletic performances. Through my research, I studied the two most used stretching techniques and their effects on muscles. The two most relevant stretching techniques that are used today are dynamic and static stretching. Dynamic stretching is done repetitively in shorter durations where the end position is not held. Static stretching is done non-repetitively where the end position is held for a longer duration of time. The first effect I studied was range of motion. Range of motion measures the abilities of muscles and joints to extend and stretch. A study which focused on stretching impacts on sports injury risk found that dynamic stretching increased range of motion for 20 minutes. Another study which focused on muscle and tissue changes following static stretching found that range of motion returned to baseline in around 30 minutes. And they further found that any further stretching increased this time. As many sports are very physically demanding, it is important to know how to increase and maintain muscle strength. A study which researched the optimal stretching on strength found that dynamic stretching for 30 seconds produced maximal strength output. A review which focused on the effects of stretching on muscle strength found that static stretching for more than 2 minutes significantly decreased muscle strength. They found that these muscle deficits lasted for up to 1 hour. Along with muscle strength, torque is affected when stretching occurs. Torque is a measure of the force that can cause an object to rotate about an axis. A study which focused on the effects stretching has on the knee extensor muscle found that dynamic stretching for 30 seconds increased torque by 25%, which lasts between 20 to 30 minutes. They also found that 30 seconds of static stretching decreased torque by 65%, which lasted for 40 minutes. The main goal of any warm-up routine is to prepare the body for exercise. Warm-up routines do this primarily by heating up the body's temperature. A study that was conducted which focused on the effects of stretching on mechanical properties of muscles and muscle warm-ups found that dynamic stretching's repetitive muscle contractions cause muscle temperatures to rise. Because of higher muscle temperatures, there's higher blood flow which allows for more oxygen to be supplied to the muscles. Static stretching, however, has no effect on muscle temperature due to its lack of repetition. As our muscles become tight, we stretch them to get loose, which is called stress relaxation. Stress relaxation is a loss in tension occurring when a muscle is stretched at a constant length. Stress relaxation is only found in static stretching, as static stretching is the only technique where a muscle is stretched at a constant length. A study found that holding a stretch for 30 seconds decreased muscle tension by 10 to 30%. They found that this decrease in muscle tension lasted for up to 1 hour. And as most sports include running, speed is one of the most important factors to improve and maintain. A study found that 30 seconds of dynamic stretching improved 20-meter sprint times. However, they found that more than 9 seconds of dynamic stretching reduced sprint times and agility due to a stretching-induced fatigue. I found no data pertaining to static stretching's effect on speed. Though much research has been done, there have been few studies on how stretching has affected speed during athletic performances. The studies that have been conducted tested speed immediately after the stretching was performed. This study will investigate how elapsed times between stretching and running affect speed. My research question is, what are the effects of elapsed times between stretching and running on speed performance? My null hypothesis is, if participants wait longer than 15 minutes, then there will be no difference in sprint times. I chose this as my null hypothesis because in my research I found that many beneficial effects lasted around 20 minutes. My research hypothesis is, if participants wait longer, then their sprint times will be slower. I chose this as my research hypothesis because a study stated that after warm-up routines is when the body is most prepared for exercise. My independent variable was the elapsed times between the stretching and running. These intervals were set at 1 minute, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, and 45 minutes. My dependent variable was the sprint time after the participants stretched and weighed their assigned times. My control was the first sprint without any stretching. And my constants include the sprint distance at 30 meters, the environment, and the stretches. The stretches include a light jog, high knees, butt kicks, opening and closing the gates, grass pickers, lunges, high kicks, groin stretches, and knee hugs. In order to test my hypotheses, I constructed a procedure. Before my data collection, I obtained consent from Dr. Jones, Pennsylvania County School Superintendent, Ms. Bowman, the Director of Piedmont Donor School, my participants, and their legal guardians. For this experiment, my population was athletes. My sample consisted of 34 high school students from Pennsylvania County and Dale City High Schools. I then gathered necessary materials such as a stopwatch and the Mount Hermon Baptist Church gym. On each day of my data collection, I prepared the gym by setting up a sign-in table, posting the stretches on the wall, and measuring the distances for my sprints and my dynamic stretches. I also had participants sign in as they arrived. On the first day of my 2-day data collection, I had the participants complete their first sprint. I record their time on the sprint by counting them down by saying ready, set, go. I would then start the timer on go. I did this all while standing on the line where they would finish and would stop the timer when they crossed the plane of the finish line. I would then write their time next to their name on a spreadsheet I made beforehand. On my second day of data collection, I first had participants perform the designated dynamic stretches. After stretching, the participants would then weigh their assigned times. Once done weighing, the participants would sprint and I record their time. After all participants finished their second sprint, I provided them with my debriefing statement and compiled all my raw data. Lastly, I conducted a statistical analysis. This graph shows the difference in times between the control sprint and the sprint after the participants stretched and weighted their assigned times. A negative number indicates that there was an improvement in time. In the 15-minute group, we can see that there's a lot of clustering, which indicates that most participants in this group perform better after the dynamic stretching, but only marginally. In the 45-minute group, there's still clustering, but this clustering is more spread out, which indicates that these participants perform better after the dynamic stretching, more so than that of the 15-minute group. These highlighted points represent the outliers in my data. There are 3 points that showed improvements in sprint times by over 1 second, and 1 point showing a worsening time by about 0.5 seconds. These outliers suggest that there are flaws in my study. For my statistical analysis, I used a one-way ANOVA. I chose a one-way ANOVA as it would show the correlation between my 5 independent groups. At the significance level of 0.05, the null hypothesis was not rejected with a p-value of 0.44. This p-value means that there was no significance in my data. However, it can still be concluded that after waiting 45 minutes, sprint times can still be improved. As previous research found how dynamic stretching affects speed over time, my study was able to add to the field by showing how stretching affects muscles over time. These findings provide support for the implementation of dynamic stretching in warm-up routines. While there are quite a few limitations, there were some that were more glaring than others. The first limitation I faced was my sample. My sample had varying levels of athleticism among my participants. Another limitation I faced was my sprint distance. My distance was set at 30 meters, which did not allow for the effects to be truly measured. And along with these limitations, shoes limited my data as some participants wore non-athletic running shoes, which hindered their running performances. Because of these limitations, future research needs to be done. For future research, I suggest that the sample size should be of participants of the same athleticism, and the sample should make up each independent group. I also suggest that the sprint distance be set at 100 meters, as this distance will better measure the effectiveness of the elapsed times. Throughout this long process, I was able to learn a whole lot about myself and my work. Because this process was not easy, I often had to ask for help as I realized I could not do everything by myself. And because this was such a long process with plenty of parts, I had to manage my time extremely well as I worked and participated in many extracurriculars. I found that not everything goes according to plan, so you always have to allow for extra time. And lastly, practice makes perfect. When I first started presenting, I was not very confident in my presenting skills, but as Ms. Long made us practice in class and at home, I got better and better. It also helped as my peers made suggestions to better improve my slides and my presentation skills. I would like to give a massive thank you to Ms. Long as she supported me throughout this entire process. I would also like to extend a big thank you to my participants, as this day would not have been possible without them. And with that, are there any questions?
Eli, good job. I think you did a very good job. Let me ask you, so that your participants, were they all athletes who played 3 sports? Were the athletes who just played one, or just people who maybe played after school ball?
Dr. Jones is asking about the different levels of athleticism among my participants. My participants all have played a sport or are still playing a sport, so they all have athletic backgrounds.
Do they play sports like soccer requires a lot of running? Golf, not so much. So were these sports where they did a lot of running, or sports where maybe it was more of finesse than conditioning?
I had a varying level. A lot of people in my study played golf, football, soccer, basketball, baseball, so it varied a lot. That's why it's a big limitation.
So your conclusion, at least from the graph, it seems to me that you're saying that the longer you wait between the stretching and the activity is the benefit? Is that what the results showed?
Ms. Walls is asking if the longer you wait after stretching is more optimal for sprint times. According to my graph, there's no specific time because it varied among each group. Like 15-minute group was a lot slower than the 1-minute group, but the 45-minute group was faster than the 15-minute group. So there's no correlation between time that I found, but after waiting 45 minutes, the sprint times were still improved. Yes, Ms. King.
How do you think your results would have changed if you recruited participants from all one sport versus a variety of different sports?
Ms. Kent asked how I think my results would change if I had participants of the same sport rather than varying amount of sports. I think it would have made the data more relevant to a specific sport rather than a broad range of sports.
So Eli, you did a great job. In your studies, were they based on students that were in school and college, adults? Do you remember any kind of specific data ages?
Ms. Collins is asking in my research how old the participants were that helped me write my literature. In my research, I found that many studies used professional athletes ranging from like 20 years old to 40 years old.
So in comparison to that, do you think it was basically the same as what you found to be true, or was there any correlation?
Can you rephrase?
Was there any correlation to the studies that you looked at to what you found when you were doing your investigation?
Ms. Collins is asking if there's any correlation between the studies I read and my study. I could not find a lot of correlation between my study and theirs.